All of you are requested to please download the program schedule from our website, nutshellconferences.com. Our next speaker is Advisor to Prime Minister of Finance and Revenue, Dr. Abdul Hafeez Shaikh. He was supposed to be here in person, but because of some emergency and urgent meetings with the Prime Minister, he is in Islamabad. But right now he's online with us, and I will request my team to please display the picture of Dr. Abdul Hafeez Shaikh. His topic for today's talk is the future of Pakistan's economy.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I want to start by thanking Asfar Ehsan Sahab, as well as Nutshell and Martin Dow and other organizers. This event is very timely, and it brings together really a lot of distinguished people, and I feel privileged to be invited here and asked to speak with a group of this sort. I want to start by asking a few questions. The first is the advantages of Pakistan. I want to start by trying to figure out what are the big facts of Pakistan, and what has been the basic development experience of Pakistan as it has grown over the last several decades, and what are the big lessons that we draw both from our own experience as well as the international experience post the Second World War in trying to think about the future of the Pakistani economy. So the first thing is that we can all agree that Pakistan has tremendous advantages and a lot of resources. Of course, we are strategically located. We have the proximity of the Central and South Asian markets. We have the proximity of the oil-rich Middle East. We have closer and closer relationships because the distances are shrinking due to the revolutions in transport and business technologies, so that the markets of Europe and the US are increasingly getting closer. At the same time, we have an abundance of resources. We have hundreds of kilometers of coastline. We have all sorts of minerals, whether it's gold, copper, coal, mining, agricultural products. We have a tremendous network of rivers and irrigation systems. And so we can establish that Pakistan is a wealthy country. And yet we have not really failed to take advantage of these resources. So the first question is that why is it that Pakistan remains a resource-abundant country while most of its poor people remain poor? So this is a question that is fundamental. The second point I want to raise is that what are the big facts of Pakistan as far as its economy is concerned? Because we cannot talk about the future without having a good understanding of the past. And as a student of Pakistani history, I want to say that the interplay of several institutional, political, and economic and strategic factors have played into how the economy has grown and shaped some of the big facts of Pakistan. So one of the big facts of Pakistan is that it has not had political stability over its 72 years of existence. And a proof of that is that no single prime minister has ever concluded its term in office. And the political transitions have been costly, often undoing some of the economic gains that may have been made. This is, I think, something in talking about the future and in sustaining reforms we have to keep in mind. The second big fact about Pakistan is that we don't like to do business with others. And Pakistan has a very poor record of either being able to sell its products to the rest of the world, that is exports, or attracting others to come and do business with us, that is foreign direct investment. So until and unless we remedy this and we figure out a way to do business with others, the chances of the future looking very different from the past are not very bright. The third big fact about Pakistan is that this is a country where the government is dominant in an excessive way in all aspects or many aspects of economic life. Government here appears to make policies for a sector. It appears to appoint chief executives for big companies operating in that sector. It appears to regulate that sector. It appears to provide financing in the sector. And because of a combination of reasons, it does a pretty poor job in operating in the economic sectors of the economy. And this huge presence of the government continues to cast a shadow on both the productivity of our economy as well as its transformation. And unless we tackle this problem again, so prior to Corona, tax revenues was increasing at 17%. Primary balance, which is the difference between your income and your expenditures, was in a surplus. Debts were being paid off, even though this government had not borrowed those. And 5,000 billion rupees of debt were paid off in the last 2 years by this government. And what was more important is that a set of policies was being designed to put Pakistan on a path of a more sustainable development. And it was around this time where stabilization was achieved, exports were beginning to pick up, the world was acknowledging Pakistan's sensible policies, of Pakistan's economic discipline, of Pakistan's expenditure management. You know that we did not borrow a single penny from the state bank. We did not give a single supplementary grant outside the budget. We even froze the expenditures of the defense, and we cut civilian government expenditures. And so it was a reasonable progression. But of course, like the rest of the world, we were struck by coronavirus, and we had to try and navigate through a difficult period. Now, where we are is that the world is acknowledging this government's sensible approach towards the coronavirus. Our first goal was to preserve the health and security of our citizens. The second was to preserve the capacity of the economy to come back and show resilience and come back and be ready to operate in the global economy as well as on the domestic side when the coronavirus began to fade. And so we offered an economic stimulus package, which had several components. The first was to try and get cash into the hands of as many people as possible, which, as you know, 16 million people were given cash transfers. equally importantly for economic discussions, we were able to give a lot of support to our business sector in terms of paying their electricity bills, in terms of deferring their principal payments to banks, in terms of giving subsidies for payroll expenses and for gas and electricity and loans, and offering a construction package which dramatically reduced taxes. So now that the first wave of coronavirus is behind us, where do we find ourselves? First, I would like to say that we are beginning to show some signs of economic revival. And in this first 4 months of the fiscal year, we have a tax collection that is higher than the first 4 months of the previous year. We have a primary balance that is in a surplus. We brought down the current account deficit, which we that both the current account and the primary balance are in a surplus. And the other good news I'd like to share with you is that the stock of public debt held by the government has not increased by $1 between June 30th and October 30th. So debt is being managed, a good set of policies are being implemented. And what I want to say is that as we want to go towards a future economic direction in which our growth, when it begins to get reflected in the numbers, can be sustained. And what I'm trying to say here is that a base is being set. At this moment, this government is in the process of setting up the base or the foundations on which a sustainable future economic prosperity can be unleashed in the economy. Now, if we want to achieve a certain vision of economic prosperity in our country, we have to think about two big components of it. The first is obviously growth, because if you do not grow, you cannot have the resources to try and share with your people or build infrastructure or contribute towards human development. But the second, equally importantly, is that how that growth gets shared. Because as I said, Pakistan did have growth in certain periods of its existence, yet that growth did not work out. Why? Because it was not shared by the people. And some people became very rich, while the others became very frustrated. One can argue that we even lost a part of our country because of that uneven economic growth. So we have to be careful that while we try and have policies for growth, we also have policies to ensure that that growth is inclusive, that all regions and all types of people benefit from it. And the second point I want to make is that that growth has to be of a certain quality. It cannot be of the sort that we experience sometimes, where we boast about growth, but in fact it is simply based on spending more in more consumption after borrowing a heck of a lot. So we also want to ensure that which components of the GDP are growing. Is it just a debt-fueled consumption spree, or is it also exports and investment, which are the other components of growth? So, trying to conclude, what we want to say is that if we are to achieve a financial prosperity and bring genuine development to our people, certain things have to be done and to be sustained. What are those? First, we have to restructure the role of our government. As I said, it's excessive, it regulates heavily, and it blocks the growth of other players from the private sector and international capital to play their part. At the same time, government is involved in a lot of unproductive activities. And for example, if you add up the federal government and all the provincial governments, the excessive expenditure simply on the wages and pensions is so high that they have no money to do anything else unless we borrow. This has to be tackled. Second, governments have been doing a lot of unviable projects in the past, which has forced us to have low productivity and at the same time has forced us to borrow more. A third very important feature in Pakistan is about the role of the provincial governments. If we are to go into a modern Pakistan, we have to think about how to improve the governance and efficiency of the provincial governments. Because the things that matter to the public, whether it's drinking water, whether it's health, whether it's gender development, whether it's child nutrition, whether it's sanity, whether it's even climate change, whether it is business regulation, all these things are in the domain of the provincial governments. And this is a very important component that we have to recognize, that until and unless the provincial governments really improve their governance, Pakistan will not be able to make that transition into a sort of future that we want. An important point I want to make is the role of the private sector. Private sector has disappointed us in the past, that they have not really figured out good alliances with the global community, and they have not done a very good job in exporting and in attracting foreign investment. This government is again, as part of that transition, adopted policies to promote exports and FDI. And you can see that we are giving all sorts of benefits to exporters. Subsidies on electricity, on gas, on loans, elimination of tariffs on raw materials to reduce the cost of doing business, the acceleration in the refunds, 250 plus billion were given in refunds in the last year alone, which makes it a kind of extraordinary achievement. And now we want to set, and of course the exchange rate regime, which is, as you know, being allowed to be determined by the markets, and at the moment is quite favorable for exports. So the private sector has to perform its role in that. The other real question is that where do we generate the funds for infrastructure development? And here also the government is setting the base for attracting private sector into the areas of water management, waste management, road building, higher education, and so on. Because if we are to transform our infrastructure, the government doesn't have either the capacity or the wherewithal to borrow. So we are designing incentives to ensure that the infrastructure development can also take place in terms of partnership between the government and the private sector. And at the same time, government is setting the base by aggressive expenditure management, by, above all, institution building. Because if we are to come out of this phase, which I call the recovery and stabilization phase, and begin our trajectory of growth, then it will be very important that we sustain it. And the sustainability requires building of institutions. And as I said, those institutions involve both the federal and provincial governments, the civil service, the private sector, and also regulators. Because if we are to generate the benefits from private sector initiative, we have to also safeguard public interest through effective regulation, not heavy-handed regulation, but well-designed regulation. And that's why this government is trying to develop the institutions like the central bank, the institutions like the SCCP, the regulatory authorities, the Competition Commission, and so on. So in the end, let me conclude by saying that development and the future of the economy depends on doing many things right. And in the present system and in the present moment, this government is committed to try and first get into the phase out of recovery and stabilization and put the country on a sensible growth trajectory, and at the same time to make the fundamental changes and design the incentives in the right way so that those reforms can be sustained to achieve the vision of a prosperous development Pakistan, as well as people of Pakistan who are able to fulfill their aspirations. This government is different from many governments in the past, that its leadership does not want to focus in terms of amassing wealth, doing business transactions for itself, promoting the interests of its family, or trying to focus on anything other than the fundamental goal of trying to bring prosperity and security both for the country and its people. Thank you very much.